This panel, this topic is incredibly near and dear to my heart, and for those of you that heard me talk about it before, the idea of a national secure data service is absolutely incredibly important. We came up a little bit in the earlier panel of thinking about interoperability, thinking about standards, thinking about the way that we can create a better data system that follows people in a way that's helpful for them as individuals, helpful for us from a policy perspective, a win-win, so to speak. And I often talk about it from a framing of a state perspective and thinking about the state's role in this work and the role that Coleridge plays in helping facilitate that cross-data linkage for bigger projects, because we know people are mobile. People don't necessarily care about borders, boundaries, but our data systems do. And so how do we facilitate that? And our vision, and something I've talked about a lot, is thinking about this from a state perspective and a state-driven, state-led national secure data service, something they own. And certainly there's questions about how this operates at the federal level now, but I think ultimately this still is very much in the purview of what states can own and create themselves. And so it's a great pleasure to introduce this panel and this topic more generally of unlocking perspectives for national secure data service. We're joined today by Amy O'Hara, Marty Johnson, Jordan Matsudera, and Robert Shea is going to lead as the moderator. Thank you, Robert. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Nathan. Appreciate that, and delighted to be with you this morning. I haven't followed my signal channel, so I don't know exactly what's happened on this landscape since I arrived. And I've worked on that all morning. Let me take a moment to introduce our great panelists. Amy O'Hara is research professor at Georgetown's McCourt School and executive director of their Federal Statistical Research Data Center. Jordan Matsudaira, professor of American University, former chief economist at the Department of Education, and Marty Moore Johnson, who's state labor market information director in Illinois. They've got lots of perspectives on the potential for the National Secure Data Service. I was a proud member of the Commission on Evidence-Based Policymaking when we made a recommendation that the government establish this center. And that was made in the context of seemingly intractable difficulties getting access to sensitive data sets. And I'm not sure we're there anymore. But that's a lot of what we will talk about this morning. So I'm delighted to hand it over to Marty, who's going to share some of her perspectives and sort of set the stage for our discussion.
Thank you, Robert. Very nice to be here. Thanks, everyone. So I hail from Illinois, and there are several of us here in the room today. I am the State Director of Labor Market Information, and I'm also the Division Manager of the Economic Information and Analysis Division of the agency in Illinois that handles unemployment insurance benefits, the Illinois Department of Employment Security. I have served in these dual roles for just over a year. Of course, most in the audience are familiar with my predecessor, George Putnam. And when he stepped away, I was offered the position and I was graciously accepted. It's been a wonderful, exciting ride for the last 15 months. And my first role with our agency, IDES, I actually joined in November of 2020. And I was managing the regional labor market economists in Illinois. We actually organize our our state into regions, and then we've assigned local labor market economists to those regions to the extent possible. We co-locate them in their regions so that they understand regionally what's going on, which can be very different than, of course, the statewide economic picture. So I managed the regional labor market economists. We disseminated labor market information across the workforce, including our education partners. So that was my first taste, really, of working in the workforce space. I've been a public servant with Illinois for the past 12 years. My prior role was with the Department of Revenue, actually, Illinois Department of Revenue, and then I spent a little bit of time, Jason was on the earlier panel, I was with our Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity as the economist for that agency for a little bit. So my line of sight across the state has been very broad. Personally, I have grown up and lived in Illinois the majority of my adult life, so I'm very passionate about Illinois. Prior to my work, incidentally, in the public sector, I was in the investment management in the private sector in sales and marketing, and so had been an acolyte of Mark Zandi for quite some time. So as I mentioned, I've been in my role for about a year. George Putnam, of course, has been a terrific mentor for me. And for those who may not know his name, I know Ahu when at the start of today's discussions mentioned that Illinois was one of the leads for our projects in the Administrative Data Research Facility. George Putnam, even from my first day when I joined our agency at IDES, he raised my awareness and stressed the importance of two things. And the first was the value of administrative data as opposed to survey data. And that was eye-opening for me because at that juncture in my career, I hadn't maybe appreciated all of the nuances. But from day one, he said, administrative data is the wave of the future, Marty. And the second point that he made to me is collaborations, not just within our own agency, breaking down those silos, but also across agencies in Illinois, and then broader on a more national scale, working with partnering with other states to share administrative data and the insights that it can unlock. So this inculcation, if you will, of these values of data, the quality of data, and the collaborations have served me very well. Since I've been with the agency, we've had a changeover in our leadership, and the director of our agency and chief of staff come from public sector work and private sector work, so not so keyed in perhaps on the value of data to unlock the insights and to tell the stories that are really important. And so when you have leadership in that, with that headset, perhaps it's helpful to be able to share with them visually what we can do with data and the narratives that they can unlock. And now might be a really good time if we can to share the slides that I brought, some imagery. I don't know if we can cue those up right now.
Cue the slides. Oh, I do.
Oh, you've got the clicker. Okay. Thank you, Robert.
I'm on
Great.
top of it. There we go.
So for those who haven't had a chance to look at the unemployment to reemployment portal, this was one of the first projects in the ADRF. We are using it to great success. And one of the avenues that I've used this serves as a demonstration, if you will, to the leadership of our agency and other agencies to understand data, when used in the right way, can tell the story that sits with people more deeply. And I know the last session we were talking about data versus the narrative or the storytelling, which is more important. I don't know that you can really pose that question, but certainly what lives with people in their minds and their hearts is the emotional story that one can glean from the images that we can share with a narrative. So on your screen, for instance, the unemployment to reemployment portal, the whole idea is to use our claims data, the unemployment insurance claims data, which my agency administers, share that information on the platform, the ADRF, and be able to tease out the insights that we can glean from that information. So for instance, we are interested in knowing regionally where are our unemployment claimants, where are those persons living in our state? Are they concentrated in one region or another? Taking that regional aspect, A, is part of the story. And then B is the next slide, and that is the UI claimants, the demographics of UI claimants. So we can look at not only who they are, whether they're a veteran, whether they're a disabled worker, if they, what approximate age group or education, but we can also look at claimants by industry to better understand where are the pockets across the state for certain industries that we need to distribute resources from our workforce agency in order to get people back working again and offer job services to those individuals. So we can break down the claimants by industry, and then lastly, the third slide, which is the final slide, we look at claimants by occupation. Again, it tells a narrative, a very powerful story about what we're seeing in the labor market. So I go back to even my regional labor market economists. This tool now is in their hands, and they're able to, at the first moment of a WARN notice, which is the notice that goes to the state level, alerting us this company is about to announce a layoff here, here, and here. The regional labor market economists can pull up these data on a real-time basis and understand who are the individuals affected, what are their backgrounds, and how do we need to work with our frontline staff in the Employment Services Division to better address the concerns that these individuals bring to the table in their current situation. So that was powerful for our labor market economists, but going back to my original statement about our agency leadership, there was some hesitation about the value of the research and is this worthwhile. Now they understand local, actionable, timely labor market information really drives the rest of the work that we do as an agency. So later this afternoon, I'll be talking more about our portal, but I just wanted to share this was our one of our initial projects with the ADRF, and since then we now have many other projects committed in the ADRF, and it's a very fruitful collaboration. So I'll be happy to talk more, but thank you.
Great,
for
thank
the
you, Marty.
introduction.
That's
Yes.
great. So you've articulated the vision of what can be. Amy, I want to move to you. I joked about whether something has happened since we came up here. Last night, the president issued an executive order that absolved agencies of any barrier sharing data with Treasury for the purpose of identifying fraud. But last week, instructed in a separate executive order, agencies to ignore limitations on data sharing, among others, for any purpose. There are a lot of legalese in there, but barriers that we thought existed are suddenly dissolving. And at the same time, you've got the National Security Data Service trying to find a purpose, trying to fill a role here. Can you give us first of all, tell us what's going on in your world, and then give us your perspective on the state of sharing, linking secure data in the federal ecosystem?
Those are a lot of questions.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I knew you could handle it.
Yeah. What's going on in my world? It's on fire.
Let me hold the mic up, make sure
So the world that we are in is filled with doubt and questions and concern and uncertainty. We heard about uncertainty earlier. What has actually happened to some of the data sources? They have been delisted. And this is from some of the earliest executive orders that came out. And so data sources have been taken down. Some of them are put back up. And it makes us wonder, is it the same data that was there before? So a number of organizations are trying to do the delta there, understand whether sources that go down and come back up have changed at all. And we are also tracking the data releases that we anticipate. Will they be on time? Will they be of sufficient and the high quality that we've grown accustomed to? Or will they have changed? How are we going to detect changes that are a result of the personnel reductions across the federal agencies, and also the data calls that are going on from the administration? It's really hobbling a lot of the activities of people that work in these agencies. And very well-meaning parts of our community are saying, well, we're going to FOIA. We're going to just demand more information. Well, that's just putting a lot more burden on some of the feds that are in there already underwater. So when we think about what's happening in the agencies, it is grim, okay? There has been a lot of very positive activity to rescue data, okay? The Data Rescue Project, find it online. They are doing wonderful work grabbing the historical information. That's great if you think that all the information you're going to need is behind us. But we have expectations for data to be released this year, next year, and into the future. Some of that is design data, the surveys. And we've heard earlier today, the surveys are under threat because of non-response. They're also under threat because of the reductions in personnel at the agencies that produce the data. In addition, we like using administrative data. I personally love using administrative data. But we're looking at this budget and wondering what is going to get cut. Whenever we talk about reductions to programs, or even not reductions to programs, but the implementation of things like work requirements on SNAP or something, that is going to change the nature of the administrative data. And so those of us who have grown accustomed to data at certain levels, at certain trends, without a lot of volatility, we are going to be in for a shock, I expect. We also have questions about some of the big core data systems like SSA or IRS that are such important inputs to what other agencies produce, whether that is the economic census or understanding of all of the economic statistics coming out of the Census Bureau, and also the IRS data as an input to the population estimates. You had beautiful maps. Those maps had denominators. We have denominators because of the public goods produced by the federal statistical system. If you don't want those to be disrupted, we need to make sure that they have the personnel and also the inputs to keep that going. So that's my overall, that's what I'm seeing going on. And I'm also getting calls from people that are inside the agencies, and they are essentially under siege. There are people that, like my old job at Census, you had standards, you had rules, and a lot of that was in statute and reg, but a lot of it was in policy and culture. And now you have people saying, I need access to that data. And there are people holding the line. And those people will hold the line until they are placed on administrative leave. And then they are replaced with someone that also tries to hold the line. But by the third or fourth person, they're caving and they're saying, well, I guess you have authorization and here's your access. So people on social media, they're saying, that's illegal. It's not illegal if they aren't moving the data. You might not like it, but it's not illegal. Just more people are getting access to the data. Is that good? Is that bad? If it really is for rooting out waste, fraud, and abuse, it could be really good. You know, it's good to detect improper payments. That is part of evidence building. So is finding out who is eligible but not participating. So from the evidence building world, we had these multiple goals. And now the question is, are the broader goals of making sure people obtain the services they are eligible for, is that still going to be on the table, or is it really going to be about finding the wrongdoers or finding perceived wrongdoers and making sure that we're contracting those programs? The final thing I want to say, you asked about the NSDS. Did I miss a grand opening announcement? Because there's a lot of interesting work going on out of the NSDS, but I'm curious what it's doing for you guys. Can you queue up? Can you show up and say, I need help with my privacy protection problems. I need help with disclosure avoidance review. I need help doing a complicated linkage because 2 of my data sets don't have the same sets of identifiers. Can you help me triangulate? The Census Bureau does that. They do that for the FSRDC, the Research Data Center Network. They do it for $26,000 per join. Would you line up if the NSDS was charging you like that? We don't yet know who is going to be able to queue up, what the costs are going to be, kind of what the rules for operating are. And that's a challenge. They've done some really interesting little studies. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it is ready to take on the enormous challenges that we have and to tie into Coleridge. Is it going to continue being an integrated data solution, or can it be a federated data solution? These are some of the questions that I have.
So Jordan, maybe you can take us to a cheerier place. No, I'm kidding. It's hard to ignore the elephant in the room, so I'm grateful for your answers. But Jordan, when you were at the Department of, you were the first chief, you set up a chief economist office. And so you saw the benefit of data linkages for managing and driving improvement in performance. Give us a window into what you learned, what the lessons you learned from that experience.
Robert, it's a bold move to toss it to somebody who was a political appointee in the Department of Education to take us to a cheerier place. So I appreciate the optimism there, and I'll try to live up to a little bit of it. I think it's worth pausing to underscore all of the sentiment that Amy expressed, and certainly in the Department of Education, there's a lot of the same and more so that's happening right now with the decimation of the Institute for Education Sciences and the NCES, and the loss of centuries of experience working with data to help inform policy across the country. So we are really putting ourselves in a hole that's going to be hard to dig back out of here. In the what feels like hundreds of years ago, the last 3 years when I arrived at the department, I was trying to move things in the opposite direction. Before working in the Biden administration in the Department of Education, I worked at the Council of Economic Advisors in the Obama administration, and in my portfolio included things related to higher education in the workforce. And at that time, worked on a lot of different issues with the Department of Education, and felt frustrated on a number of different policy topics where leadership across the department and the White House were trying to make decisions. There were a lot of questions that had answers. We were trying to reform the FAFSA, think about ways of making it simpler, wondering, if you use prior year income, or if you set once and for all aid eligibility, how would that affect the cost of the program? How would that affect the aid received by different sorts of students? Unfortunately, the nature of decision-making in the White House is, things are kind of batted around as pie-in-the-sky ideas, and then on a Friday night at 7:30, somebody says, we're going to do this. We need to make a decision about whether we're going to do variation A, B, or C. We're going to make that decision tomorrow. While it technically might be feasible to answer those questions with the data that exists at the Department of Education, there really weren't people there who were ready to do those analyses overnight between 7:30 p.m. and 10 a.m. the next morning when a decision was being made. Going back to my time there, I really thought the department needed more capacity to be able to work with its administrative data, to feed into real-time policymaking conversations on that kind of a pace. And so when I joined the department this time, I kind of joined with some sense from leadership that this was also a kind of value they shared, and they understood the utility of that, like given the fact that the administration was planning what was close to $1 trillion worth of executive actions on student loans and generally higher education-oriented issues. Being able to leverage the data from over 150 million people that have received federal aid to further their college dreams, leveraging those stories to be able to inform what we were doing made a lot of sense to a lot of people. And so I was able to build this team. We brought in a group of what grew to be about a dozen PhD economists or PhD to be PhD students to work in the office, and we're able to build a group that was able to use administrative data very rapidly to be able to inform policy, and we did that in a lot of different ways. I think some of the big picture takeaways that I have there, and maybe this circles back to some of the kind of the current set of events that are happening is one of my biggest takeaways is just the feeling that evidence-based policy has kind of a last mile problem, where we've kind of figured out a lot of the technological solutions to being able to bring different sources of administrative data together. We have people, incredible new methods, machine learning, natural language processing, AI-fueled algorithms to analyze that data and extract insight from it. But getting it to the table, making it legible to policymakers, making policymakers think, like when they're having a conversation about, hey, should we do X, Y, or Z? Making them think that before we decide X, Y, or Z, maybe we should have some evidence about like which of those things are actually going to accomplish our goals best. That's where I think the real innovation of my office lied, and it was in having somebody who was, simultaneously a deputy undersecretary, the kind of number 2 person on higher education policy in the department, at the table in conversations where those decisions were being made between the department and the White House, and could anticipate the decisions coming down the pipeline and be ready with evidence to inform conversations in a timely sort of a way. So that's I think what the office kind of brought to the table. Now, I think the kind of lesson that I took away for the current moment is just that you really realize that a lot of people in high positions, in policy positions, do not understand in their bones like the value of these data, do not understand the harm that they're doing to their own future ambition by turning off the lights and defunding a lot of this infrastructure across government. And so I think that's kind of a challenge for us going forward, is really trying to get that message across and making sure people understand the value proposition here, to make sure that we can kind of turn the ship around from where we are now.
Thank you. Marty, how would you answer that question? What do you need from the federal government? How would you articulate the importance of that partnership doing what you do?
I think that's a great question. I think from a state perspective, my experience so far with the ADRF and the work that we continue to do and the new research projects that we keep pushing up into that environment in order to gain the insights and have the evidence that will help our policymakers in our state in particular, but also the other states that partner with us. There's just inherent value in that process. One of the things that I know George has made clear is that the reason that this has been successful, that bottom-up approach, is that the states know their own data, and then we partner with other states, and we figure it out on the ADRF platform, and it's a bottom-up approach. And so I think overall we need built-in capacity within the federal data systems to promote that statewide kind of bottom-up approach on the development of not just measures of labor market activity in particular, and that's just the view that I take as the state labor market director. But we also need resources for the sandbox that allows that bottom-up scaling, from projects that we started with a product like the unemployment to reemployment portal to practice and actually putting that into practice. And so there's value in the bottom up because we're learning as we go, and we can incorporate the mistakes that others made in the whole process and learn from each other. And that has value as opposed to a top-down approach saying, well, we're going to start it this way. We feel strongly that the projects that are successful, we need to take note of lessons learned and to have guidance then from the federal level to say what's scalable, and then for the federal leadership to step in and say, we want to accelerate the learning curve by sharing across other state agencies, other platforms, and also have a common framework in which to operate. But again, from a state perspective, I think we need a little bit of top-down, but the bottom-up approach, I think, is where we sit has a great value. But coordinating all of us to do all these multiple projects in the ADRF, certainly that guidance would be welcome and very helpful. Besides just financial resources, of course.
Yeah. Two things I want to note. One is please raise your hand if you have questions, because I want you to get involved in this conversation. The second is we received a letter from Sharon Boyven, who would have been here if she could. She's with the National Science Foundation on a future vision for the National Secure Data Service. Progress, realizing the original vision had been slow, and it's definitely slowed in the current environment even further. Give me your perspective on what we can do. Jordan, you mentioned a little bit. What can we do to articulate to policymakers on a bipartisan basis the importance of ensuring that we have this critical infrastructure for collecting, not only collecting, but using data any bright ideas on agencies are making to having to justify the specific function and outcome individuals are performing in order to keep those jobs at their agencies. Contractors likewise have to be very specific about what they're accomplishing in order for their contracts not to be canceled. How would you answer that question were it to be put to you about these matters? Anyone? You're all going to have to answer it. So
I'll take a first stab. I mean, a lot of people on the Hill have kind of reached out asking for, ideas for how to try to push back against some of the cuts that are made. And, in the Department of Education kind of world, like what is the value behind the contracts that are being cut here? What are the things that something like the National Post-Secondary Student Aid Survey, like what is that doing for us? And I think, like I was saying earlier, a lot of the key is just really mapping out for people exactly what these data allow us to do that we wouldn't be able to do without it. And so, I've spent a lot of time talking to people about, for Republicans on the Hill who are currently considering a variety of very ambitious reforms to the student aid system in reconciliation, saying, that you have a risk-sharing proposal a debt limit proposal, say, that suggests pegging graduate loan limits to the median cost of attendance across the field of study. And there's currently no information that exists on that other than the information that exists in the National Post-Secondary Student Aid Study, which you've just canceled the contracts for. And so there's really, you'll be making these policies entirely in the dark. It seems likely that the most recent wave of data collection, which was in the field this past year, but the data have not yet been released. It would be nice to have more up-to-date data to be able to design these policies in a better way. But as it currently stands, there's no way that we're going to have that information, and potentially won't have it going forward in a moment where a lot of people's constituents are very concerned about the cost of college. And again, the only kind of comprehensive source of information we have about that comes from this survey that you've just canceled the contract for. So I think just making very direct connections to people between the information, the resources that we're trying to build, and what they can do with them is really key to having support. And I think that's a message that resonates across the act.
no, Amy.
So NIPSAS, the survey that he was just talking about, it is a standard survey. Data are collected, but then the respondent information is matched to their student loan information. And that is currently being done using SSNs. And we were fortunate to work with Lynn Woodworth when he was the head of NCES and Mark Schneider when he was running IES to be able to demonstrate how privacy-enhancing technologies would be able to achieve the same thing without exposing those SSNs. And that is exactly the sort of work that I would love to see a National Secure Data Service take on. How do you get the data matched the way that we need to get the insights, but how do you do that by ramping up the way that we can protect student privacy, worker privacy? So that is, I think, a really good example of what we're missing. And I think that would be a way to say what the value proposition would be for an NSDS moving forward. But for those of you who were listening to Jason in the previous session here, he was like, why is this so fixated on evidence building? And that was a question that many of us had on the Advisory Committee on Data for Evidence Building. So he was on the Commission for Evidence-Based Policymaking, which said another group should come forward and study whether and how there could be an NSDS. And one of my fellow committee members is in the room. We struggled for 24 months to figure out what an NSDS can and should look like. And we wrote a report that I joke, we got paid by the word. We had way too many recommendations. But there is a roadmap that's out there. The question is, in the moment that we're in, with these EOs that are knocking down silos, they're knocking them down for program integrity, not necessarily for evidence building. Is it time to square that circle? And if we do that, we have to have some really tough conversations with the federal statistical system that said that it's good to use the administrative data, it's good to do these linkages, but never shall you ever get that information down to individuals that could be identified. It always had to be done with the output being something that was aggregate statistical information. But now, if you're going to build, why not build for multiple purposes? If you need to do something that says this is the guy that's double dipping snap between DC and Maryland, you don't need statistical information. You actually need a name. The struggle that many of us had in the evidence building space is that we were looking for these enormous investments that were never going to achieve the work, the tactical operational work that states and counties need done. And so is this a moment taking advantage of these EOs to explore that broadening of the aperture?
So a lot of those limitations now illusory, and we're in a new landscape. Yeah. Marty.
I think a final comment perhaps goes back to this whole idea of administrative data versus survey data. We saw in the earlier presentation about how surveys are not as robust as they used to be, that there's the non-response rates. Of course, I oversee the BLS programs in my agency, and that's a common concern, that our respondents, they're just simply not responding, so much so that we're looking to perhaps mandate it. As a state, there have been many states that have mandated responses to the BLS surveys, and so we're poised to consider that in Illinois, but it hasn't come to fruition quite yet. But the administrative data, I think that's just part and parcel of the work that we're already doing as an unemployment insurance agency, and so the administrative data can perhaps be plug in where the survey data are leaving us short. So, for instance, I'm on a blog, TLR Wire, which is they talk a lot about economic issues and workforce issues. Erica Groshin was quoted, she's the former BLS commissioner, and she was just within the last 2 days quoted as saying that UI claims, unemployment insurance claims, which is perhaps the penultimate administrative data, is a potential source for measuring the labor market activity. And so states have, and incidentally, that's what we use to populate our unemployment to employment database and all of our the data visuals that I shared earlier. So that claims data or that administrative data can stand in for some of the lack of the survey data that we aren't getting. And states, by the way, have been innovating in this area for more than 5 years with a proven track record of those products. And we feel strongly that that's something that could scale up rather easily. And it's not a matter of, well, we're going to pull funding away from you, you can't collect your administrative data. It's just part and parcel of what we do on a daily basis to administer our programs. So we cut out slightly the reliance on the survey data by putting front and center, scraping what we can from an administrative perspective. I'm not sure how it translates easily into the education world, for instance, but certainly for workforce and measuring that level of economic activity, it's just dare I say it, a lay down. Now, of course, you've got to understand the data and understand how to clean it. I mean, there's still hiccups in the data and noise, so we can't just take all of it and drop it into the ADRF and expect that it will be functional for us. But that's where we come in as the labor market analyst and economist. But that flow of data is not easily interrupted by lack of funding or otherwise outside pressure saying stop doing that.
Any questions from the audience right now? Gone? Okay, so we've talked a lot about, or we talked a little bit in pieces about what the NSDS is not, what it might do. Can you give us a more holistic answer to the question, what is your ideal state for the NSDS or a function of that nature. Amy?
I just want there to be a measurement ecosystem. I think the NSDS would be an important part of that, but now, right now, I'm afraid that we are destabilizing data supply in the United States. And it's nice to think about what an NSDS would do with data, but it assumes that there are data. I think that we need to be very aware of the availability, the stability, the reliability. You know, I am nervous that if the economic indicators aren't going in a direction that is pleasing to the administration, that there could be a thumb on the scale and people are like, oh, don't worry about that. People will notice. Okay, so what if you notice? What are you going to do about it? You know, and it doesn't even have to be from any sort of dark arts. It could be you get rid of the probationary people at the Census Bureau, which hits the field group more than the headquarters group. And all of a sudden, you don't have representative data collected across the United States feeding the unemployment rate out of the CPS basic. You know, so it's these, you need to be connecting the dots between what is happening with the personnel part of it, what is happening with the policy part of it, what is happening with the deregulation EO. The way that these things are just layering upon each other, it is unclear to me how agencies are going to deal with that. So that is not the answer that you were looking for, but you can't answer your question without there being a data infrastructure and trust in the data that are being collected.
It does seem quaint to have worried about early release of some of these data sets.
Yeah.
Jordan?
I feel challenged to go darker than Amy.
Don't do it. Don't do
I
it.
believe in you.
Yeah, I mean, I of course agree with every thing that Amy was saying and share a lot of the same concern about the future going forward. And I do think that's the first order concern. We need the data to be high quality. We need the data to exist before we can worry about any of these other things. But let me engage in the reverie of pretending that we'll get through that part of things. You know, I think the federal government has so much information consistently measured across different populations, and making that available to a broad base of users just really unlocks a lot of things. So one of the first ways that I got involved in government was leading the College Scorecard project when I was at the Council of Economic Advisors. And I think just kind of stepping back now with about 10 years of history, just the power of putting those data together, which is to say being able to consistently measure earnings across earnings outcomes for nearly every college in the United States in a consistent way, in a comparable way, really dramatically changed the conversation around higher education. And I think really illustrates the power of being able to put data like this together. I think the College Scorecard in some ways is a model for what's possible, only instead of just facilitating data exchange across federal agencies, you know, you can imagine being able to do this now for, you know, so the way the scorecard works is the department sends SSNs to the IRS and the colleges that those SSNs are associated with, and then we get back average earnings measures and other kinds of measures. And that same kind of pathway had only been used in that sort of way for the department up until now. But while I was chief economist at the department, we were able to kind of modify the same data production process and leverage some of the same kind of legal data sharing agreements to be able to create data products that informed other policies, like how to target debt relief in the population by kind of creating information about the economic well-being of several different distinct target populations that we could measure in our data, but didn't have earnings information about. That kind of capability could be expanded across different state governments and localities as well, to be able to get the same kind of information to inform workforce strategies, any other kind of policy that you can imagine. And I think it's incredibly powerful to be able to do that. So, I think continuing to push to make progress, and again, conveying the value in that is important. So I hope that we're in hibernation mode here rather than, as Amy put it earlier, mummifying mode, where the contents of the things wrapped up in bandages are going to turn to dust in a short amount of time here.
Marty?
Well, I'll riff on what Jordan just shared, and that is I'll take the upbeat perspective and assume
Thank God.
that there's some new life that will be generated and breathed into this whole federal statistical system. I'll shift gears just a little bit, and I think what we have found to be very valuable with the ADRF, with some of the projects that we've participated in, is the common set of expectations, parameters around the governance issues and who will have access to the data, and having those be generally accepted so that everyone knows what to expect, and having common, and perhaps digging deeper into the data. When you're working with other states, the definitions of data may differ, so allowing for some collaboration to define variables and to measure them in a consistent way. So we've got data governance and the governance policies, and then the data sharing and the access, and then kind of lower than that, which is how do we define the variables, and what's even valuable to even be included in a national data service. And I'm taking the hopeful view that this will just be a temporary blip, and that there will be some appreciation, just as my agency directors, not to call them out, but it took a little bit of coaxing for them to understand the value of the data going into the ADRF and the amount of time we committed to it. The turning point for them was when they saw the data visuals and the narrative that came along with those visuals of how we actually used the data going into the ADRF and collaborating with other states, and what we got out of it in terms of, we have a separate project that evaluated some WIOA training programs, and some of which weren't very good news. Well, that was very telling, and that type of a narrative, to realize we couldn't have done that research in the absence of this shared data platform. The leadership understood, okay, we get it now, that it's not just data for the sake of data, or research for the sake of just doing the research, just the value of the collaborative effort and the outputs can change what we're telling our policymakers at our General Assembly, and those running other agencies, like our education partners, for instance, had some eye-opening takeaways from some of the outputs from our ADRF platform. So I'm hopeful that things will be, that this is just a temporary pause. Because I, for one, I just got here, so I feel like I'm so excited to move it forward. So I'll count me in. I'll be pushing for it.
So it's early days, early hours actually, since we've entered an era where limitations on data sharing have been lifted. I say they've been lifted. We don't really know what the practical lifting of those limitations means. But have you given any thought to what that means for your ability to access other data sets across the federal government? Any of you? Have you tried to imagine what the possibilities are now that these barriers are theoretically dissolved?
They're dissolved for improper payments right now. So a lot of my projects don't involve improper payments. So